James B. Stockdale Chair in Ethics in the College of Operational and Strategic Leadership at the Naval War College, and as the Distinguished Chair in Ethics at the United States Naval Academy and Professor of Ethics and Public Policy at the Naval Postgraduate School. Other institutions he has taught at include Georgetown University, Notre Dame University, Emory University, Randolph-Macon College, the French Military Academy at St. Cyr, the Catholic University of Louvain, Belgium, and he chaired the philosophy department at the University of Santa Clara in California. He has authored 7 books and over 60 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters, and is president of the North American chapter of the International Society of Military Ethics. Please give a warm welcome to Professor George R. Lucas, Jr.
Thanks, Major. Appreciate it. Thank you, Major Westgate, for that wonderful introduction. Thanks to the Foundation for inviting me to be here with you. And may I say it's a great pleasure to be here. Let's see, can I have my first slide, please? There we go. This is my topic for the day. This is the title of my talk. These are the things I want to discuss with you as you get ready to spend your day in panel discussions and small discussion groups, topic discussion groups. But I did want to say a word of special acknowledgement, excitement on my part, I guess, to be here at Fort Leavenworth. Now, you know, immediately you start thinking, well, I don't want to hear that. Everybody says that. It's obligatory. In my case, it's the fulfillment of a family prophecy that my grandmother made about me when, gosh, about 60, 65 years ago when I was just a little kid. And I was doing, I don't know, whatever it was, playing with matches, trying to steal money from my mom, or drawing with crayons on what kids do when they're that age, right? And my grandmother looked at me and shook her head with disgust, said to my mom, "Sissy," she'd call my mom Sissy, "Sissy, that boy's going to end up in Leavenworth someday." and I did. Slide, please. I'm here. Yeah, I've made it. So this is the fulfillment of a family prophecy, and it's a real pleasure to be here with you today. By the way, if any of you are wondering, I'm sorry, I'm not that guy. My joke, after putting up with a lot of teasing over the years as he did all the wonderful work he's done, including the sport of education, which I think is extremely significant on his part. But my joke was he does imaginary wars with imaginary robots, and I help you guys do real wars with real robots. So it's my only comeuppance. No, I don't have any tickets to any of the latest Disney releases. So you're going to have to put up with what I do have, which is just a few words, I hope lighthearted, but also focused enough to get you started in this discussion this afternoon. The problem is, this morning and this afternoon, the problem that I see is that I've got to be here to talk to you about ethics. And in my experience, the E word, as we call it, is very much like what the General just described. It's something that we've overexposed, and it's something that we've trivialized. For people like Professor Shannon E, or Hugh Shelton, chair in ethics, my good friend and colleague, who's helped organize this symposium with Major McKinney and the Foundation. For people like us, we think ethics is really important. We think it's about human behavior, about how we treat each other, about what we owe to one another, about what rights and duties and obligations we have. It's about things like human rights, justice, showing compassion, being benevolent, and so forth. So that's interesting. But as the General suggested, for most of us, particularly in the military, and also in business organizations, ethics is about compliance, usually with a bewildering array of regulations that are complex and burdensome, and they get so frustrating. In fact, I can speak from a standpoint of a DoD civilian that we get so exasperated with the regulatory environment that we live under, we say to ourselves and to one another, and you've probably witnessed this with the civilians who work alongside and who work for you, if we want to avoid doing anything wrong, our best bet is to do nothing at all. Next slide, please. And so that's kind of what it turns our workforce into. And you probably experienced your own frustrations with that kind of thing. Ethics training, as it's known, becomes for us a kind of periodic experience, either of the JAG coming in or the IG or the corporate lawyer, at reading rules and regulations, and maybe reciting some of the horror stories of people who have violated them. So I was privileged to be able to speak to recently promoted flag officers at one of these ethics training modules, ethics inoculations, I'd call them, a few years ago, preceded by our Navy, at the time, our Navy IG, who came out and did just this kind of thing. He read the horror stories. And one of them was about a rear admiral, a two-star, who had absconded with his mistress, left his wife, absconded with his mistress, and had booked them tickets in the defense travel system to travel together to Buenos Aires. No kidding. Now think about that. I heard this, and of course this was supposed to be an agreement. I can't get DTS to book my legitimate mission center domestic travel. How the hell did he do that? That was my question, but in any case, that was our ethics brief. Often that training, in addition, is inflicted on everybody after a scandal of some sort. Next slide, please. How many of you, just a show of hands, how many of you have heard of something in the Navy that you probably enjoyed reading about since you're the Army, of the Fat Leonard scandal? Anybody? Oh, yes. Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a minute. But guess what? Everyone in the Navy, everyone, is going to be made to have ethics training in the aftermath of this scandal. Go Army, beat Navy. Yeah. This can be downright offensive, as well as tedious and boring and just really off-putting. So the problem that I've encountered over the years doing the work that I do is that ethics connotes something that's unpleasant, that it's not an opportunity to learn, it's an opportunity to waste a day or two of your time or an hour or two of your precious time and be bored and frustrated. And also angered because it seems like you're being blamed for something. So you want the definition of ethics that satisfies this kind of thing that the General and I were talking about? Well, I'll give you one. And I want you to pull out your pads and write it down, because there will be an exam at the end of this seminar. And here's the definition you can take away of what ethics really is for most of us. At least in Lucas's definition, ethics is a form of punishment that we have designed to inflict upon those who have themselves done nothing wrong. So get ready to enjoy yourself. But in point of fact, may I have the next slide, please? I think when I look at what your organizers, what Professor French and Chaplain McKinney and the others have done for you today and tomorrow, it's not that at all. I'm really pleased to see that it's something much more exciting. In fact, the only thing that's likely to be boring and tedious is, this opening keynote address. And if you can survive getting through this, you're going to have a pretty exciting, engaging, interesting time over the next few hours, the next couple of days. You're being invited to engage in a number of really perplexing and intriguing moral dilemmas. That's the phrase you see up there, moral dilemmas, pertaining to the military profession itself, especially the problem of conflict between moral values and commitments that you encounter in the midst of armed conflict. Moral dilemmas arise in the pursuit of war and in its aftermath. They range from the treatment of enemy combatants or inflicting unintended civilian casualties in the fog of war to war's aftermath, to the health and well-being of those we ask to defend the nation and fight the nation's wars on our behalf. These moral dilemmas occur in conventional combat, they occur in hybrid war, they occur in the development and use of military technologies, for example, increasingly autonomous, lethally armed platforms and robotics, and in cyber conflict. Well, these are areas in which Professor French and I both have spent numbers of years doing our work. Next slide, please. Have done a number of things that have been fun and interesting for us. And those are some of my recent books that Major Westbrook mentioned. Professor French's has many articles and books in this area, and including the second edition of The Code of the Warrior, about which I'm going to be talking a little bit later. One of the most widely read and used books on military ethics in the world. So we find that stuff interesting. And that's the kind of thing that we're being invited to discuss here. So let me go back to the last slide, if I could, please, and ask the question, what then is a moral dilemma? What do I mean by that? A moral dilemma is a situation in which a person or persons of good character and best intentions nonetheless face situations or choices in which they may be uncertain, disagree with each other, and wonder what is the right thing to do in that specific situation. A moral dilemma for the military may involve uncertainty or disagreement over how to apply everything from specific rules of engagement in a particular situation to broad moral conceptions of just and unjust warfare to the most fundamental principles of the warrior's code and the warrior's honor itself. These are profound and perplexing problems about which reasonable and well-intentioned people can reasonably disagree, and frequently they do. Okay, by contrast, what I mean by a test of character is the kind of thing that interests Congress or our chain of command in ethics training, that kind that I called the punishment inflicted on people who have done nothing wrong. That's some kind of scandal involving bad behavior, drunkenness, sexual harassment, waste, fraud, abuse, dereliction of duty, conduct unbecoming an officer in UCMJ language, all the way to downright criminal or corrupt behavior. Here, in contrast to legitimate moral dilemmas, there's no question about what's right. That's why I think this distinction is important. Moral dilemmas, we don't know and disagree over what is the right thing to do when we're trying to do the right thing. In a test of character, by contrast, what's right and wrong seems pretty clear. And the question is, are you going to do it or not? Are you going to measure up? And so there's no question about knowledge about the right and wrong from the moral and legal point of view. What's at issue is that some group has chosen to do something wrong, despite the laws and regulations and even moral common sense. And then they brought the whole organization into disrepute. That's what I call a test of character. And those involved usually have failed that examination rather spectacularly. So let's have the next slide. Sorry, 2 slides down. There we go. So this guy, well, let's start with the admiral who flew off with his mistress to Buenos Aires, and DTS let him get away with it. While the rest of us get those irritating messages in the email that say, your travel authorization has been stamped disapproved. Somehow they pulled this off. And Fat Leonard, well, for those of you who might have been on another planet recently and hadn't heard about it, we had 250 senior naval officers and counting as the scandal continues to grow, and some civilians in the NCIS accepted bribes, gratuities, special favors, things like meals and parties and hotel accommodations and concert tickets, shopping sprees for spouses and so forth. And they were doing this in order to be asked to turn a blind eye or in some cases even aid and abet Mr. Leonard Glenn of Glenn Defense Industries in Singapore to defraud the Department of Defense and the U.S. taxpayers of millions of dollars in overcharges for provisioning and refueling ships in port. At least one NCIS investigator helped cover this up, if you can believe it. You know, you listen to the theme, da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. This is not what we had in mind. It's not what they feature on the program. Go Navy. Talk about what goes on deployment, stays on deployment. We'd like this to go back on deployment and disappear. It is really embarrassing. So you ask yourself, what were those guys thinking? What the hell? I mean, how could they imagine this was appropriate professional behavior? Clearly, this was, at minimum, a spectacular failure of that test of character. So, let's see, reasoning it out. Lady Gaga tickets, ethics rules, shopping spree, lavish banquets, professional decorum. You know, doesn't seem very difficult to puzzle this one out. So what's going to be the interesting piece of this case? Why would it even be considered morally significant or called an ethics failure? It's going to be a psychological question. What led the individuals? How could it get to this point? Is it a bad command climate? Is it a disease of the culture? Is it a few bad apples? Those are the questions people want to know when they examine these tests of character. Did this happen to these people gradually, inadvertently? Did they find themselves sliding into it? Were they deliberate, on the other hand, or just bad apples from the beginning and nobody caught it? What the heck? And why didn't anybody blow the whistle on this or stop in some way, intervene to stop it? That kind of ethics is usually what's done or covered or prompted to give the rest of us the kind of training you're getting or the kind of experience that supposedly would bring us together here today. Thank God it's not that in this case. It's something much more interesting. So I've made my case about the difference of these two kinds of things, and I hope in the process clarified what ethics is for you. Not tests of character, but genuine moral dilemmas that you face in the pursuit of your professional responsibilities in uniform. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so this is one of the preeminent questions you'll be discussing today and tomorrow. How do we know, when push comes to shove, that we're on the right side, that we're doing the right thing? That's what your organizers have posed for you. And it's an intractable, puzzling, troubling set of dilemmas for anyone who wears a uniform or participates in the conduct of the nation's wars. How do we know for certain we're right and they, whoever they are the wrong ones, the unjust combatants or the illegal combatants? And just let me pause for a second with a sidebar and say, those are not exactly the same thing, unjust combatants and illegal combatants. Suppose, for example, that I'm an insurgent in Syria. I'm fighting against the Syrian military and the government of President Bashar al-Assad. I could be labeled an illegal combatant because I have no official standing in international law. But I would nevertheless protest that I'm fighting on the side of justice and morality against a cruel and ruthless tyrant who deserves to be deposed. Now, on the other hand, I could be considered a legal enemy combatant as a member of the Taliban, fighting against invaders in my own country, and that would be you guys, right? Occupying forces. But my reason for fighting could still be morally unjust. Not just a desire to impose and follow religious law in my home country and expel the foreigners, but to destroy sacred religious sites, persecute enemies, exact revenge on the general population, and generally institute what we might call a reign of terror, for which there's no moral or legal justification at all. So the legal combatant in that case would all nonetheless be the unjust combatant based on his or her intentions. What do they hope to bring about? By the way, that phrase, reign of terror, is a good one to keep in mind when we think about the governments against whom we find ourselves arrayed. That was the name that history has attached to the very first years following the French Revolution in 1789. Things did not go as well for liberty, fraternity, and equality as everyone had hoped at the time of that transformation of French society. The reign of terror is the period that followed, and it was terrible indeed, as it is now in Syria. Furthermore, even if international law and custom accord me the same status of a legal combatant, give me that status, I'm then required to follow some rules, some constraints that are also in that law of armed conflict. And I'm entitled to its protections if I'm caught or captured. If my side or I myself fail to follow these constraints, I forfeit my legal and moral status and I become an unjust combatant, even if I was originally a legal one. So that's another way we can determine. I mention this because this helps us think through some of the hard problems you'll be facing in your panel discussions today with respect to opposition to other nations and non-state actors. How do we know we're right and they're wrong? Well, one way is who does what and with which and to whom. But even if all sides in a conflict more or less tried to abide in good faith by those legal restrictions, how would our side then know, in addition, that what we're doing is right and what the enemy or adversary is doing is wrong? Isn't that important above and beyond what the law itself permits or forbids? And don't we often say to each other, well, you know, when it all comes, push comes to shove, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. So Syrian President Assad calls his political adversaries terrorists and uses illegal chemical weapons against them. We call them freedom fighters, opposing an unjust dictator who should be made to step down. And we accuse him of war crimes even when he uses conventional weapons against his own civilian population. Well, who is right? And how are we to deal with this question when we're unsure? That, again, is among the moral dilemmas that we're convened here to discuss today and tomorrow. Okay, your organizers posed those set of questions for you to wrestle with together in 3 panels. One concerns our conflict with China, the second with North Korea, though that's changing by the day, and the third with Salafi jihadism, with Islamic extremism. Now, I note the Russian Federation isn't on the list. There's not a 4th panel for Russia, though there could have been one. I'm wondering, from my standpoint, working in cyber, I wonder if somebody from the FSB or the Russian Mafia contacted our organizers, the chaplain's office, and said, hey, leave us alone, or we're going to hack your server, and we're going to out the entire group here, falsely, of course, on Ashley Madison or something. We'll mess you up. So we backed off of Mr. Putin. Who knows? But that's the kind of warfare we're fighting these days. But regardless, the 3 panels that are on the list have covered a lot of territory that's really worth thinking about, really worth considering. I'm looking forward to we have some very distinguished experts that your organizers have brought here today to serve on those panels and lead your discussions. Some of the best people in the country, if not the world, in their respective fields. So this is going to be interesting, and I'm hanging around for all of it, and I'll look forward to seeing you there and hearing what you have to say as well in these panel discussions and small groups. Let me prepare the ground then for that, if I may, by offering a few thoughts and suggestions for how you might think your way through this. Let's start with that common saying. Can I have the next slide, please? Yeah, that common saying, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. Let me go on record saying that really pisses me off. I take exception to that claim. I think it is as false as a claim could be. It makes my blood boil, in fact, when this phrase gets tossed off casually in these kinds of conversations, and maybe some of you have done this, you know, even yourselves. But what it does is tend to equate our own fighting forces or berate them equate them with the enemies and adversaries against whom they are arrayed. And I just think that's an outrage. Now, why do I think that? What gives me the confidence? Understandably, I'm loyal to my side, as I'm sure you are. But this is our question. What beyond our loyalty, natural loyalty to our own side, gives me confidence that there's something more at stake? As the General said in his opening remarks, quoting Admiral Stockdale, that moral relativism is not going to do the job for us. There are some bedrock ground truths, and there are some certainly at work in these kinds of conflict. Well, my answer, what helps us, is behavior. What people do. Ye shall know the tree by the fruit it bears. Do you really have any doubt that the kind of warfare and tactics that President Assad is waging against what was originally a peaceful political opposition among Syrian citizens until he started bombing and gassing them demonstrates that he and his government are in the wrong, morally and legally? What others can and should do, the rest of us, to help the victims of his atrocities, that's another matter. That's another moral dilemma, and maybe it'll come up in your discussions. But that second dilemma only comes up if we're crystal clear that the first is not a dilemma. We're very clear. What he's doing is wrong, and the insurgents, the original insurgents, not including ISIS, getting to them in a minute, not including them, were right to oppose it and right to feel like they are justified in fighting against him and trying to defend themselves. The same is true with ISIS, the Taliban, and al-Qaeda. Whether or not we should, as in the U.S. and coalition and its coalition allies, whether we should be helping them and engaging in what's become our nation's longest ever running war, that's a secondary and very important moral dilemma. The question of what we do and how long we should do it and involve ourselves in that situation, if at all, is a moral dilemma that arises only after we recognize that there's something gravely wrong going on, which we believe must be opposed in some way. At least we have to stand up and be counted as going on record saying whatever right and wrong are, that's wrong. Again, consider the behaviors as well as the contrasting motives. Shannon and I often had our students, back in 2001, read what was the late Osama bin Laden's fatwa, his declaration and call of the faithful to jihad against the U.S. and the West. It was eloquent, it was compelling, it was well-reasoned and full of legitimate complaints and concerns, ranging from the defiling of holy sites in Islam to the deaths of upward of 1 million Iraqi children of starvation and disease resulting from nearly a decade of economic sanctions that had been imposed by the United States and the United Nations in the aftermath of the first Gulf War against then President Saddam Hussein. So the fatwa was an eloquent statement of what we would call a just cause for war. There was a problem. Bin Laden had a legitimate point about justice. These were serious offenses. But the first thing to notice is they were largely inadvertent and unintentional. Nobody wanted those children to die. And that effect of blockades and sanctions on helpless civilians is itself a serious moral dilemma that may come up in your discussions. And you should consider it before we ask our politicians and diplomats to impose those sanctions. They're not, as they're often described, diplomatic versus military solutions. They're also a form of warfare, harsh warfare, that some are now calling soft war or unarmed conflict, in which grave and serious harm is done, often to non-combatants, even though no kinetic force is used or employed against them. And the coalition U.S. troops stationed in Saudi Arabia were there not because they wanted to be there, but because they were invited by the government of Saudi Arabia prior to the onset of the first Gulf War to protect the Saudis from what might be an invasion from the north. So technically, bin Laden was right. These were infidels and unbelievers occupying sacred Muslim sites. But they did not mean to, and they would have been glad to go home. They didn't want to be there. They needed, there was necessity, and there was an invitation. So in any case, here's a point where we can do some careful moral reasoning. Harm is being done. Offense is committed, even if inadvertently and unintentionally. What should anyone do, like Osama bin Laden, in response? And how should that response be carried out? Mr. bin Laden had no political, legal, or moral authority within religious law, Sharia itself, to issue such a fatwa, let alone to undertake military measures in response. He was not, we would say, a legitimate authority empowered under any legal or moral regime of any religious or secular sort whatsoever to declare jihad. And the war he waged involved deliberately attacking prohibited targets using illegal and immoral means. Likewise, the Taliban, as the legitimate, more or less duly appointed government of Afghanistan at the time, nonetheless allowed al-Qaeda to undertake these unjust measures from within its borders and refused legitimate legal orders to force al-Qaeda to cease and desist such activities. In effect, the legal government aided and abetted the commission of illegal and immoral activities within its borders, violating its obligations of legitimate sovereignty. Now, I'm saying these things, your probably eyes glaze over. This is not legal and moral quibbling. These issues are important. These are the activities and considerations that would enable any third party, disinterested third party, a judge or a jury, if you will, to determine guilt and innocence, even if there is sympathy. That's my point. Even if you sympathize with the cause of the adversary, this is what would help you decide that they had no right to pursue that cause through these unjust, illegal, and immoral means. So one man's terrorist is decidedly not, I would maintain, another man's freedom fighter. If that individual or organization employs unjust means of conflict, attacking civilians, for example, beheading prisoners, think of that terrible situation in which ISIS captured the downed Jordanian pilot and put him to death, burned him to death in a cage. There's an example of something that allows you to differentiate, even if the cause is just or the purpose was legitimate, that the means taken to enforce it or to pursue it is off the table. It's out of bounds. If so-called freedom fighters engage in the kind of indiscriminate torture and atrocity in pursuit of their cause commonly associated with terrorists, then they too are simply terrorists. There are no freedom fighters in that case. And on the other hand, if the freedom fighter refuses to attack non-combatants like children caught in the middle of the conflict and does not engage in atrocities or torture against the adversaries they take prisoner, then they are freedom fighters. And their opponents, even if it's the presumably legitimate government of Syria or the Taliban in Afghanistan, are themselves the terrorists. In all cases, there is this, what I'll call a moral asymmetry, an inequality, unevenness, based upon their conduct of the conflict. That's what determines who is who, and who may take some reassurance that by their conduct they prove that they, and not their adversaries, are serving the just cause. So that's the answer to that question that I've posed up there. Can I have the last slide, please? So as we prepare to adjourn this plenary session and go to our panel discussions afterwards, I'd like to invite you in this session, in the time remaining, feel free to raise any comments, questions, or responses that you may have. And I'd like to leave you with these principles, if you will, a set of conceptual tools for your discussion. Now, many of you have already recognized, you see where I'm going with this. I was talking about which parties in a conflict have a cause that's just or unjust. For example, I questioned the authority also of Osama bin Laden to declare and wage war as a private citizen of a Sunni Muslim nation. Sovereignty and legitimate authority are likewise on the list there, important considerations in determining which side serves the just cause. So too is the cause they serve. I allowed that possibility that adversaries and enemies might indeed have a legitimate grievance or a just cause, but absent a clearly legitimate authority to act and to make such a determination, they would require at least some other things to give them permission to behave. Things like a right intention, for example, to restore peace and establish the rule of law, and a willingness to conduct hostilities proportionately with discrimination and restraint. These are all words we use, and you find them in international law and in rules of engagement and so forth. But I'm trying to argue today they're not just abstract or arbitrary principles. They're serious and very, very grave, important conceptions upon which our knowledge of our own behavior stands and of its justification as well as those of adversaries. Imagine, for example, imagine if ISIL, ISIS, the Islamic State, whatever you want to use as the label, imagine they had joined other insurgents against Assad in Syria, and in the process managed to overthrow the Syrian government and carve out an Islamic State in the Levant, complete with a caliphate under the rule of Sharia. Imagine that had happened, and that was the outcome years ago of the original conflict against Bashar al-Assad. I think much of the civilized world would have welcomed such an outcome. Had the resulting government behaved with justice and decorum with its neighbors, treated its own citizens, including POWs, with decency and respect, what undermined ISIS and led to its destruction was precisely its intention from the get-go not to behave in such a fashion. Once again, instead, to establish what amounted to a reign of terror, oppressing citizens, beheading and maiming captives and prisoners, and generally showing themselves to be a travesty of a legitimate Islamic State. In doing so, they completely forfeited their opportunity to achieve their own political goals and led the rest of humanity to pursue them with as much vigor as they did the Assad regime. So I think, again, behavior matters, and that's how we determine who is who and what is what. Many of you have studied the principles that we're discussing under the label of just war. Probably many of you have also quietly dismissed these principles or said, well, that's nothing but a Catholic doctrine, or it's a theological doctrine, or it's a Western doctrine, or a Christian principles, or something like that. That has no standing, no authority over other regimes or cultures or religious faiths. Well, to you, I want to say this in response. Read my lips. Horse feathers. It's horse feathers. That is not true. You find these same principles in the writings of the great military theorist Sun Tzu and the political philosopher Confucius. We find them in the teachings of the Buddha and his disciples. The Buddha was himself a member of the warrior caste. We find similar teachings as well in the sacred Hindu texts, the Vedas, and the Bhagavad Gita, concerning whom may and may not be attacked in warfare. Despite the reprehensible behavior of Islamic extremists that you'll be talking about on that panel, we find similar moral principles canonized in the legal philosophy of Islam itself, both Sunni and Shiite texts. Okay. So these are not Western principles. They're far from constituting exclusive or relative principles. The eminent political thinker Michael Walzer described this over a quarter century ago in his book, Just and Unjust Wars, as what he called the moral reality of war. Moral considerations, he wrote, have always and everywhere played a central role in the discussions and debates about war, and they'll play a role in yours today. And these specific principles are guidelines that we find in those debates, which help us discern who fights on the morally justified side, constitute what Professor Shannon French has famously called the code of the warrior. They appear in some form or fashion in practices, values, and teaching of warrior cultures across the world and throughout history. They are, as she notes, what distinguishes a warrior from a mere murderer, and what distinguishes morally justifiable conflict from mere murder and mayhem. As such, these moral principles are the precious legacy, the core values of the military profession itself. They serve together to define what the U.S. Army recognizes as the Army profession and its ethic. If I may, I want to leave you with this personal story. Some years ago, I was giving a talk like this to a smaller group at a small college down in Mississippi, in Jackson, Mississippi. There was a young Marine enlisted in the audience. He had been on 4 tours to Afghanistan, and he was really messed up. He was having a lot of trouble. I'm sure you're familiar with the situation. When I went there to give this talk, his professor told me about him and said, could you sit down with this young man and talk to him? Maybe you could help him. And I agreed to meet him in the professor's house after the lecture. And we sat together quietly, alone, and he stared at me for a long time with accusing eyes. And finally he raised an arm and pointed his finger at me, and he said, you and your colleagues, you and the people you work with, you're getting us all killed. You're making us fight with our hands tied behind our back, at least one. And you're making us vulnerable to death and injury. Well, I knew what he meant. He had heard my talk about this and about constraints in warfare and proportionality discrimination and non-combatant immunity and POW treatment and all those kinds of things, economy of force, all that stuff. Instead, I looked at him for a while and I said, well, I know what you mean and I understand your anger, but you need to know I didn't make those rules. It may look like people who look like me wearing ties and sipping champagne in the great halls of Geneva impose these regulations on you, and we don't play the game, we don't suffer the consequences of the risks. And I know that must be very, very frustrating. But in fact, they're not my rules. They're your rules. If they did not exist, you and the men you fought alongside of in Afghanistan, you would have made them and imposed them on yourself. You would have worked them out for yourself as limitations on your acceptable behavior, just like generations of warriors before you have done with theirs. You would never, for example, have thought it was your purpose to kill children or to kill POWs or destroy villages and take the lives of hapless civilians for absolutely no reason whatsoever, just for the fun of it or just because you were angry at them. You would not have used more force than was needed to defeat the enemy, subdue him, and you would not fight at all unless there was a compelling reason to do so, and no alternative remaining other than to fight. You would have judged it as you do yourself now judge, that behaving in these ways, the enemy's ways, are degrading, dishonorable, can I say it? Unprofessional. The code of restraint, I told him, that's your code, the code of the warrior. And you yourself were never simply behaving like a murderer or a killer for hire in the service of your state. Instead, you undertook a far more difficult task, the most difficult task the world can impose upon any one person. You were, as you are here today, a warrior. Thanks for listening, and I'll be happy to entertain your questions if we have a few minutes before you have to go. Thank you so much. Go ahead, Major.
Some have warned that there is a widening cultural gap between those who serve in the military and the rest of American society, some even calling military service a family business. How can we better inculcate our professional military ethic into the diverse young men and women who join our ranks?
There's really several observations there, each of them very important and some of them deeply troubling. the widening gap between military and civilian culture, something about which Thomas Ricks of the Washington Post has written eloquently in books of his over the years. Perhaps a consequence of the all-volunteer military, a profession of the profession of arms, if you will, professionalization of it, and that this is one of the downsides, that for people who don't participate and aren't invited or made to participate, thanking you for your service is not enough. They need to know what that service is and what it costs. How are they going to learn? And so I think in terms of that gap, one of the most important things, certainly we who are civilians working alongside you and supporting your effort, is to do the kind of thing I was describing, where we can go out and explain, as you can yourselves, exactly what it is you do, what the military profession of arms is. And it's very clear, not just in this country, but in many countries, in Europe and so forth. I teach over with the French Military Academy, and their soldiers envy the reception you all get here by contrast to what they get in France. They feel like they're really outcasts. And that the only way you can disabuse a larger, uncaring civilian population about this is through education, through public speaking and writing and presentation and so forth, trying to, for those who aren't then compelled to serve, that they would learn more. There are things that everyone needs to know about the military profession and what it is, what it does. And we don't know that very well, and we need better knowledge. So that's one thing. The other piece of the question that's interesting that you raise is the family business part. That, I think, is not altogether a bad thing. I think it's a bad thing to impose very heavy burdens on a single family. But the idea that families have a tradition of the members of the family studying and practicing the law, or studying and practicing medicine, or serving in the military, that seems to be a very natural and honorable thing in itself, as long as it's not accompanied by the gap that we're talking about, that it isn't imposed on those families. It is a choice. It's a matter of honor, family honor. Many professions, not just the military, depend upon that kind of family tradition. So there's some good elements and some bad elements there, and the bad ones have to do with ignorance and a need for greater public education. And that's what I'm committed to. Thank you, Major.
Paddle 1.
Good morning, sir. Major Steve Williams, Staff Group 15 Alpha.
Good morning.
I just want to ask, do you think it's possible to reconcile the principles of just war with the necessity for total war?
The necessity for total war. There is a discussion in the just war framework of a situation like that supposedly faced by Prime Minister Churchill in England in World War II, in which things are so desperate, we are in such dire straits that we cannot afford to follow the normal constraints on war. It has to be war, it has to be total war with no holds barred. And that situation is called a supreme emergency. So the first thing to notice is that you only, if that's right, and I'm not sure it is, if that's right, the only time you get to declare that you are exempt from the constraints on targeting civilians and mistreating POWs and annihilating, using excessive force for no good reason at all, is if you do have a good reason, that you have an exigency, a supreme emergency that's so severe that it's necessary to do these things that we wouldn't do. In a way, it's like applying just war theory to wars, to already justified wars, if they get serious enough. My question is, exactly when does that happen? What situation are we in? Right now, the conflicts we're in are, in a way, the opposite of total war. They're very frustratingly limited war, hybrid war, soft war is a term I use, in which case nobody's threatened with being annihilated, and there's no need to, engage in strategic nuclear destruction of the entire planet or even an entire country or civilization, although that's one of the things that was discussed in the North Korean case that you want to examine. Were we willing to go there and see the whole Korean peninsula go up in flames over the dispute we were having with the North over its nuclear policy? My view is just war theory doesn't go away in the midst of a war when we're having trouble. I think, like any other set of moral constraints, that the important time to recognize them is precisely, as in business ethics or anything else, when things get tough, you don't say, oh, I'm going to set the rules aside. That's when the rules come into play most strongly to help you remember who you are and what it is you're trying to accomplish. So first, I have doubts about the situation ever arising that's a supreme emergency, even in World War II, that necessitated some of the things that were done then by all sides. Secondly, even if one argues one's in that situation, that it's not necessarily the case that all bets are off and all rules are to be set aside. That's my view. Whether it's an informed or correct one, well, that's for you all to wrestle with as you talk on the panels about how we deal with China or how we deal with North Korea, or Russia for that matter. So thank you, Major, for that question.
Paddle 2.
Good morning, sir. Good morning, sir. Major Grady Stebbins, back row here, Staff Group 12 Charlie. You offer a compelling argument for the justness of American actions, and I certainly don't disagree. I wouldn't be standing here if I did. I think that it's only troubling in that one could argue that they are maybe a justification for punitive measures, especially given the two recent examples that you gave of ideological wars, both the war against al-Qaeda and the war against ISIS. So given those two examples, if we as a modern leading ethical society are desiring to remove injustice from the world, or at least lessen it as much as possible, then what do you think we should be doing to address grievances to the left of the conflict or before it occurs in order to prevent the next ideological war?
I think that's a great question, Major. Thank you. I think one of the most interesting things for me in the current administration was when one of my favorite Marines, in fact, I dedicated one of my books, the one on military ethics, to General Jim Mattis when he was CENTCOM commander, not having any idea he was going to end up in retirement becoming the Secretary of Defense. Very glad that he is. And he'd be the first person to point out, this is a guy who doesn't walk away from a fight, on one hand. On the other, it was General Mattis who said we need to spend more money on the State Department, not on the Defense Department. We got plenty of money. We have plenty of things to do. You might argue with whether we have all the resources we need, but that's another matter of how we spend the resources we have, I think. But his point was well taken. Are we doing enough to avoid having to use the military in a constant, ever engaged, punitive fashion, putting out fires, punishing miscreants, if you will, or chasing them down almost like global police, instead of using appropriate preventative diplomatic measures more effectively? And the general is certainly in favor of the latter, though quite willing, if need be, when it was time to send something at President Assad to let him know that his behavior had crossed a line. At this time, the line would not would be met with opposition when it was crossed. So yeah, I think my attempt is not to simply make you all feel warm and fuzzy and good about what you do. And in fact, while I do believe most of the activities that our American military has been engaged with its coalition forces have been legitimate when measured by the criteria I proposed, the behaviors of the adversaries in question, still, that doesn't mean everything that we've done has been without flaw or fault. We too have made mistakes. committed infractions of those rules in anger and haste, in frustration. And we've been involved and asked by our political leadership to involve ourselves in conflicts that perhaps would have been better settled or addressed in some other fashion than just sending in the Marines or sending in the 82nd Airborne or the 101st, as we always do. So it's not like this settles the issue. It's more like it helps us understand whether or not you all are being asked to do legitimate business or whether there's a question to be raised about our wider civilian leadership and maybe some good military advice. Sometimes you have to tell the boss he's wrong, and that depends on the boss you have, how open he or she is to receptive they are to criticism. We haven't always done a good job of that. Our military advice, I remember General McMaster wrote when he was a lieutenant colonel, I think, in War College in Carlisle, wrote a book based on a thesis that he called Dereliction of Duty, and claimed, we need to do a better job, and the generals, he was writing historically about the Vietnam era, our generals need to be willing even to suffer being dismissed or pushed aside or losing influence with the commander-in-chief by telling him and telling the public the truth about the strengths and weaknesses of our policy and the effectiveness, degrees of success with which we're pursuing it. So I'd say that's probably the thing that we need to work on the hardest. That's not exactly your job right now, but some of you will have that responsibility as time wears on. Not sure that answers the question, but I don't think it's a question that can be really fully answered. I think it's one that has to be argued, and it'll certainly come up as you discuss your reactions to the kind of situations we've posed for you that Professor French and Chap McKinney, others have posed for you on these panels that you'll be participating in.
It's paddle 4.
Good morning, sir. Major Abid, Staff Group 6 Alpha. So first of all, let me express my appreciation on how you differentiated between ISIS, ISIL, and the likes, and the Islamic Sharia, and how you explained that laws of armed conflict and much more is already part of Islamic Sharia given 1400 years ago. So thank you for that. Coming over to my question, sir. When you judge a conflict by the principles of just war that are flashed in front of the screen, and you have two conflicts, A and B, I will not name them, but in one, and by you I don't mean US, I just mean a country. And if you engage in one conflict and then you do not engage in another conflict, don't you, and engaging a single conflict is easier because you can just go through these principles, but when there are two similar conflicts, you engage in one and you do not engage in the other. Don't you think that is what creates the ethical dilemma for soldiers who are taking part in a conflict, as well as the target audience and as well as the people who are part of the conflict in both points, where they feel that maybe the actions are not ethically justified because it is selective application of this principle?
That's a wonderful dilemma and problem to pose. Certainly inconsistency in acting on our principles, whether the we is us, the US, or our allies, or NATO, or, a situation, as you're describing it, two situations, both equivalent in every respect, but in one, perhaps we intervene militarily and take a stand and generate a response. The other, we let it slide. First, when that happens, there's absolutely no question that that's deeply and profoundly troubling to everyone involved, to observers, spectators, what does it mean to have these principles if we follow them selectively, or if we can't depend upon those military forces and political leaders in the world to enforce them consistently. And it's also perplexing to those men and women in uniform who have to carry them out. Well, why are we here today, but we're in this country, but weren't in a similar one, last year when they were doing the same thing to their people? There are so many situations where that arises, and it is deeply troubling. Now, why does it happen? Is it a matter of judgment that these aren't similar situations by the politicians? Or is it a political issue that, well, yeah, once we've decided that we have two equally egregious offenses, the problem is our adversary in offense 2 has nuclear weapons, for example, or has some kind of extenuating circumstance, hostages that would be harmed if, and hostages may not just be a few kidnapped people, it may be the neighboring nation or a minority group that exists within the borders of the state in question. So it becomes this political question of what is feasible, and maybe feasibility is the thing. You say, well, look, I'm sorry, some people like to say, my mother and others, ought implies can. So if you have an obligation to behave in a certain way, it means it's possible to do so. But in this second instance, behaving inconsistently as a result of it not being possible to do anything. We can't get troops there. We can't risk starting a much larger conflict, something like that. So it's just like in your personal life, sometimes when you have moral principles that you believe in very strongly, but you say, I'm not able to stand up as strongly as I would like for them, for reasons that have to do with proportionality, that the damage suffered by sticking to the principle would be so great as to make it unreasonable or irrational to try to defend the principle in that one case. So there's where I think, education and ability to do some moral reasoning helps allay the confusion that can occur, but it doesn't mean that inconsistency just based on ignorance and, frankly, political incompetence doesn't occur all the time and isn't a deeply frustrating problem, especially for all of you. I don't know what to do about it.
Sir, I think we're out of time. On behalf of the CGSC class of 2018, thank you for speaking at our ethics symposium and sharing your knowledge.
Thank you. Thank you all very much.
I think there's one more slide that's going to come up here. All right, so if you're attending the panel on China, you'll need to catch a bus out front to and from the McHugh Training Center and Conference Room. Buses will depart for the McHugh Center at 10 o'clock and 13:15, and the bus will bring you back here.